Here we are at page 77 of Listen Humanity, chapter 6. Some smiles, some tears. As day began to break, the air was chill, and the breathless quiet of evening still lay over the rolling hills and valleys. Occasionally, a sharp dagger of sound pierced the soft cloak of silence, and then was lost as instantly in its folds. The crackling cough of the night watchman on the hill rasped now and then, and finally there were whispers in the kitchen as the first of the household staff arrived. The village of Irongown began to come to life, and the lights of the tuberculosis sanitarium across the valley were switched off. The cooks and the houseboys and Sabasees at the foot of the hill began to cough and talk. Suddenly, by consent of nature, sleep was at an end, and drowsing, sleep filled eyes were tolerated only in specially set aside places. It was day and time for the activities of living. The entire world came alive with a rush and forgot that only moments before its nature had been the blackness and the weirdly moving forms of a dream within the dream. Breakfast was served and finished in minutes. Several buses were to arrive at 8 o'clock from Ahmednagar to take the entire group to Merazad at Pimpalgaon, some 15 miles away to the north of Ahmednagar. The dusty, rattling contraptions drove up promptly, and the Sabasees piled in with gay spirits and ample buffoonery. Down the dirt and stone road between the pleasant shade trees, the cloud of dust clattered. Already the road was filling with bullock carts, bicyclists, and pedestrians. India is a land of ceaseless tides of restless humanity, her roads glutted by a flood of people moving constantly to markets, to fields, and on business to the next village. But even these understandable pursuits cannot account for the total motion. Millions more must simply be moving for want of a reason or a place to be still. As the buses carrying the Sabasees sped towards Pimplegown, an elaborate game of nerves was played occasionally with a vehicle coming from the opposite direction. The opposing drivers would race determinedly down the center of the road, honking excitedly at each other to give way. Inasmuch as Indian roads are often 1 lane wide, sometimes one and a half, but almost never two, the challenge was to judge at the last possible instant the final intent of the opposing driver. The one who lost must take to the stubble, while the better poker player proceeded on the quote unquote paved section without a moment's let up on the gas pedal. The game has many variations and is a fine source of excitement. The surprising part is the unexpectedly low mortality rate in such a hazardous form of roulette. The Oriental is by nature a much more intuitive individual than his Western counterpart. In some way, his intuitional feelers apparently bridge the shrinking gap between the two crash course vehicles, and in a quick play of personalities, the relative force of intent of the two rivals is gauged. As an outcome, both drivers are usually preserved to play the game again. Occasionally, the psychic interplay is not concluded until the last possible moment. Undoubtedly, this denotes two almost perfectly matched contestants. The result is nerve shattering to the passengers, particularly those unproven in the razor sharp school. In such cases, driver and passengers alike in both vehicles erupt into a volcano of abuse at the other driver, at his passengers, and at one another. The bus trip to Pimplegown was quite tame in comparison with a real roaring country excursion by auto, but it had its moments of thrill when oncoming buses and trucks chose to exert their claims, or when bullocks, too stubborn to recognize any traffic rules, heaved to the side at the wrong moment. Even so, it would have been a dull trip if it had not been such a glorious day, and if they had not been going to see some of the most sacred spots associated with Baba. Just 2 or 3 miles short of Pimplegown, the buses ground to a halt to ford a narrow stream. Shifting into low gear, they grunted and felt their way carefully across the gravelly bottom. The precaution was needed, for occasionally the current would unexpectedly hollow out a deep hole, which could easily break an axle. Beyond the stream and through a bit of forest, they broke into the open fields surrounding Pimplegown. They curved to the left, the village lying to the right, a low line of small huts and buildings. At last they came unexpectedly to a halt at the side of a collection of strung out sheds. This was the back part of Merzad. Strangely standing out from the collection was the blue painted body of some old passenger bus. Several of the small buildings clearly served as bedrooms, others perhaps as storage sheds, and a garage or two. The whole was too complex to register clearly at a glance. Baba was there with the Mandalay, waiting for the Savasis to arrive. After exchanging a warm round of greetings, Baba set off at once in the lead to show the Savasis the grounds and buildings. The large party strung out in snake-like form as Baba rounded the end of the protecting barrier of outbuildings, which had first been seen, and which shielded from view the two principal dwellings of Merzad. These were of frame and stucco construction, 2 stories high, set in magnificent garden, showing clearly the careful attention of one who knew the soul of plants. There was a further fact which distinguished the garden. Each plant, shrub, and tree possessed its own individual dignity. None was banked into an anonymous mass designed to achieve background effect. And yet the overall impression was one of individualism blended into coherent harmony. Baba led the group into the larger of the two principal dwellings, built in a style which might be described as a combination of Spanish hacienda and California ranch type. The effect was charming, simple, and cool. This was where Baba rested at night. One could not have wished to find a place of more simple, uncluttered taste, and yet showing no semblance of monastic austerity. One could imagine here scenes of simple human jollity, of pathos, of elation, of life lived to its fullest, and yet stripped to its most enduring essentials. This was Baba, but it was also Baba suffused through discerning, feeling hearts and hands. Why try to describe in exact detail the furniture and the arrangement of the rooms? In this case, these are the trivia, and the atmosphere, the all. One could feel human hearts opening out in trust, hinges of the human soul creaking into action that had long been immobilized. The weight of human worry lifting as if hollowed from within to an indifferent weightlessness. Here, the process of finding the divine within could happen even to oneself. But time did not stand still to allow the formality of endless speculation on the seed. The human tide moved on through the quarters and around the exterior of the second house, now unused. Here, through the years, had been housed many women from the West. Baba led the line of Sabasis out across the cornfield and towards an abrupt hill that rose in back of the property. As they began to climb Seclusion Hill, one of the young Savasis struck out from the sinuously winding path and began clambering directly up through the brush. Baba immediately had him called back and then admonished him. There is no one here who can beat me climbing this hill, but we are here together to keep each other company and not off on an excursion. As they came to the top of the ridge, two level spots could be seen, which were paved with bricks. One lay at the extreme top of the ridge, while the other was perhaps 100 yards back and below. Between the two ran a narrow trail atop the slim spine, the hill falling away steeply at either side to the gentle roll of the plain below. The two cabins, built of asbestos sheets, now adjoining the garden below, Baba explained, were originally built at these spots. When I used to remain in seclusion in the cabin on the summit, some of the Mandali would occupy the one on the lower ridge. You can well imagine their problems, especially getting from one cabin to the other when I summoned them, often at night when the wind would be blowing furiously over the hill. Once I lived here on a few sips of water for 7 days. I have remained fasting and in seclusion for much longer periods, but 6 of the days I passed here at that time parentheses 1947, were equivalent to 6 months of my other fasts and seclusions. When I undergo suffering for the world, the load I have to bear is gigantic and affects even my physical body. I look I look then as if I had just passed through a severe illness. As the Savasees looked about them and at the tiny dots far below, a sense stole over them of events which towered into the sky, and they knew, as if the years had suddenly parted into the dim future, that on these two leveled spots, where now only brick floors remained, one day shrines would rise as people commemorated and worshiped the unfathomable. Here I felt that I would wish to fall down and worship too, for the far beyond was mightily close, and it swept all about one and pierced insensibly to one's soul. After they had descended, Baba collected the group again in the cool shade of the garden, letting them quiet down of their own wills before he addressed them. Tomorrow, when you go from here back to your homes, some of you will take photos of Baba with you. But what Baba wants you to do is to take Baba with you. As you leave me, you should take as much of me as you can. There is no doubt that I am in you all. However, it is up to you to take me with you and to keep me with you. To come to me is difficult in itself. Having overcome this difficulty, do not go away from me for anything or to any place. When you leave here, go straight back to your homes. You have come for me and you should go for me. If you leave to visit other places and do other things, do all that after completing the circuit of coming and going exclusively for me. Whatever you do, do it wholeheartedly. Let there be no half-hearted dealings between us. Having come so near to Bombay, one of you has received a number of telegrams from business connections there. But I have asked this person to return home first and then return to Bombay. I don't want you to be half-hearted in your business with me. At this point, Baba apparently recalled that in the newness of the routine of the morning, he had forgotten to inquire about their sleep. During the past days, I have made it a routine of inquiring how you sleep and whether you were all right. Some have described visions or other experiences which kept them awake. Some have said that they could not sleep because their immediate neighbors were snoring loudly, and others could not sleep because they were indisposed. I have comforted in one way or another those who did not sleep. One person stood up once because he saw that I embraced all those who did not sleep well. Now, those of you who did not sleep or who do not feel well should stand up and not hesitate to speak frankly of your troubles. As a number arose from the group, Baba stood up also as one of those who had not been able to sleep. When the roar of laughter which greeted this died down, the usual person by person quizzing went on. One individual had had a vision lasting more than 12 hours. Baba did not allow him to finish his detailed account, but motioned him to sit down, saying that what he had been experiencing was good and that he was not lying. The audience was then told that this man had often been with Baba since December 1938, when, as a boy in his teens, he had composed songs about Baba. Baba then turned towards him and gestured. Now listen, whatever your experiences may be, there is no reason to beat on a tom tom. Listen to me very carefully. When we narrate such experiences, we cannot help saying, quote, I saw this, I felt that, and so on. And so one must take care not to let it get unbalanced and allow the importance to shift to the fact that I experienced this or that. For thus, the ego is tickled and thereby magnified unnecessarily to one's own detriment. One has to go a long, long way to achieve the summit of self-realization. While trying to reach that goal, even rishis and munis, sages, are apt to fall through expressions of egotism, are apt to fall through expressions of egotism. Do not make an exhibit of your love for me. If it is strong enough, it will shine through simply and clearly. Of course, when I ask you, you must tell me truthfully your feelings and experiences. I like you. You possess a pure, innocent heart. Go on loving me more and more. To do that, you need not stop taking care of your own family. Also, do not get upset when your initial state of tranquility is disturbed. As the quizzing about conditions of sleep and health proceeded, the conversation was studded with frequent outbursts of chuckles when matters repeatedly took a lighthearted turn. Although the air of concern of the ill or sleepless one was deftly transmuted in each case into light-hearted acceptance of the situation, there was never the faintest suggestion of lack of full concern on Baba's part. The master psychologist was at work, and out of the dull stuff of human troubles, there was produced a leavened loaf of full-bodied optimism towards the future. Marion, could you unmute and continue for us, please?
Yes. The quizzing and the sympathetic jollity came to an end, and Baba turned his attention again to more weighty matters. Each time he prepared to discuss one of these subjects, its start was unconsciously anticipated by the audience, and an expectant hush would steal over them. This would be one of the last, perhaps the last, of these discourses, and the men waited in keen anticipation for the subject Baba had chosen. Now I wish to talk with you about miracles. This matter is always coming up, and no matter how often I tell people that I have never consciously performed a miracle, these stories still persist. I want to tell you all very honestly again that I have never consciously performed a miracle. Ages and ages ago, I did perform one great miracle, and the whole of this illusion of creation came from me. Footnote. One must bear constantly in mind the context of my Father and I are one. I will perform another such miracle at the time when I break my silence. That will be my first and last miracle in my present incarnation. Expect no other miracle from me, and do not associate me with any others. There is a stream of letters from both East and West describing the wonderful experiences of people who say they see me and find that I do things for them or experience things which happen through my intervention. This is all news to me, as I do nothing of the sort. But there need be no wonder at these things, for people's own love for me and faith in me can do anything. Rawalbai, tell these people what you have personally witnessed when your district badly needed rain. One of the Savasis rode to his feet and in a few brief sentences told of one of Baba's most ardent followers who had asked in Baba's name that it rain in their parched district. And to the joy of both those who wanted the rain and those who loved Baba, it had rained. We need not doubt what Rawalbai says, Baba continued. He has witnessed this with his own eyes, but the fact remains that I did not know about this, and I did nothing to bring the matter about. If I wished, I could make this harmonium dance and play songs all by itself in front of you. Seeing this, you would be sufficiently impressed to obey me, but your obedience would be towards the singing and dancing harmonium, not me. You should know two things which have happened during the last 2 months. In one instance, a dead child whose parents did not love me and who had not even seen me is said to have come to life again as my name was said over it. In the second instance, a young man who loved me dearly and obeyed me implicitly died a tragic death with my name on his lips to the very last. Let me tell you first of the so-called miracle of the dead child returning to life in my name. We recently received a letter from Hamirpur describing this event in great detail. A seeker after the truth by the name of Ramdas was directed by his guru to call on me at Satara during my last seclusion there. It happened by coincidence that I had sent for all the resident Mandali to discuss a phase of my work with them. When I inquired if all were there, Erich had, in all truthfulness, to tell me about the visitor whom they had left behind. I then allowed Ramdas, the visitor, to come to see me, but only through one of the windows, and he was instructed then to go away. Shortly thereafter, he tells my followers in Hamirpur, he saw me in 3 different forms, as Ram, as Krishna, as but I have forgotten the third name given in the letter from Hamirpur. Because of the vision Ram Das had seen, he went into the countryside of Uttar Pradesh rather than to Nasik for this Sinhast periodic fair as he had originally planned. In Uttar Pradesh, he first fasted for some time and then began to spread my message of love. Ram Das selected an area hostile to love and devotion, but he prevailed upon the head of one village to agree to a kirtan, a discourse on spiritual subjects accompanied by music, held in my name at the village head's home. It is said that he had agreed to this because one of his children was seriously ill, and that his suffering had made him remember God. But let me say to you that one who remembers God in the hour of happiness remembers God best. My worker arranged the kirtan, and in the middle of it, the sick child suddenly died instead of getting well. Despite the ensuing confusion, Ram Das remained steadfast and, taking the dead child in his lap, continued the kirtan with even greater zeal and devotion, meanwhile offering profound silent prayers to me. The child returned to life before the kirtan was ended. Baba paused to let the audience absorb the full import of what he had said. Perhaps in some situations, a similar group would have cheered, but these men had been long enough in Baba's presence and become sufficiently conversant with the unexpected nature of his viewpoint to understand that even this great event was part of illusion. They waited soundlessly for the story to spin on. Because of this, thousands in that village and the surrounding countryside expressed their enthusiastic devotion towards me. But I say that this enthusiasm and devotion were not truly for me, but for the incident which had occurred in their village. Regardless of the fervor of their expression, it was not out of love for God, but for love of an additional illusion which had occurred within the illusion of their daily lives. Baba then singled out the one from the audience who had held the dead child on his lap. Listen to me, Ram Das. The child did not return to life because of any miracle on my part. Even granting that the child really revived due to your love for me, this is not a great thing. The really great thing would be for yourself to die in your love for me. Here's a footnote. Not literally to die physically, but to the importance of the world of illusion. Beware of your eye. Never let your ego feed on cheap things. Crowds easily gather around you, but do not let yourself become lost in the crowds, for you would be finished once and for all. Now I will tell you of the second miracle, which happened only a month ago. Some of you must have seen or heard of Navroji Dadachanji of Bombay. He and his family love me dearly. His son, Noser, died recently in a flying accident near Hyderabad. He was a handsome young man and deeply devoted to me. Besides helping to support his family, he also spent freely from his salary as an instructor in the Indian Air Force for my cause and in my name. He had called on me at Satara just before he went to Hyderabad. As I had instructed him, he never failed to take my name each time before flying. This he did when he was leaving on a routine training flight. He and one other were in a two-seater plane. And as things sometimes happen for reasons which will never be known, the plane suddenly dove straight into a lake and both men were lost. Nazaire was one of my gems. He died with my name on his lips and has come to me. The quiet of the group was profound. Baba looked very small for the moment in the silent garden, and yet something akin to a fierce pride seemed to burn in his eyes. One felt very close to the eternal miracle, and the sense of it spilled through the silent audience. The spell of human souls touching one to another lasted a full eternal moment. And then Baba roused himself to complete his story. At the time of the accident, I had gone on to Pune to rest from my seclusion. It was there that Nozaire's family sent me a telegram with the news of the accident, expressing their regrets in it for disturbing my rest with the news. Such love is what I consider to be the true miracle, the miracle of love. Again, a moment of no speaking, of the quiet, even breathing of the Savasis. Again, Baba plunged on. In reality, there is nothing such as death or birth. I know this, and I say it with the authority of my conscious knowledge. We are all in eternity, and we will always be there. Really, none comes or goes. None is born or dies. But to experience this truth, we must first free ourselves from the bondage of our ignorance. After 100 years or so, you will all have dropped your bodies, and yet you will still exist. Do not think about your bodies, but think about me. Then, before you drop your bodies, you will be able to remember me. My miracle will be enough to make you become me. Although all of you regard yourselves as belonging to different religions, nationalities, etc., to me, you are all one. I have not the least objection if you go to meet saints of any religious sect, pay them your respects, and remain in their company. They are all in me. If you feel that a particular being is a great saint worthy of your respect, why should you not revere him? But if you want to see God and to become one with God, then the only solution is to catch hold of my daman, hem of garment. If you care only for God, and if you have the one soul sincere desire for union, God realization, then hold on to my daman exclusively. If you want things such as health, wealth, children, and other material things, then don't come to me. There are many saints capable of satisfying your desires, and they might be pleased to give you what you want. I am what they call in Iran a Shah Saudagar, Merchant Prince. I am neither a wholesale nor a retail dealer. If you're in the market to purchase a pin or a needle, you must go to a retail merchant. I am not dealing in merchandise such as granting favors. A Shah Saudagar can and may, if he likes, supply anyone with even a pin, but it would be unthinkable to approach him for such a thing. With this, Baba rose and walked on through the garden, around the end of the smaller of the two houses placed in its midst, and back to the road beside the long line of sheds and low dwellings. Here, the immediate Mandali slept while Baba was in the Ahmednagar area. Two of the structures to the rear and set off at one side were the reconstructed small huts, which had been carefully dismantled and carried down from the small mountain. The blue bus body sandwiched into the lineup, Baba explained, had been used by him and the Eastern and Western women Mandali in a long tour of India. Later, at Baba's request, the body had been detached from the chassis and set up at Meherazad, where Baba had spent the 40 days of his great seclusion. In it, June to July 1949, just previous to the start of the new life phase. After that seclusion at Meherazad, he gestured, it took me and the Mandali 2 full months to arrange and carry out at Meherabad the winding up of my old life and to make preliminary arrangements for the new. Except for my future tomb on Meherabad Hill, I gave up permanently everything which was in my name, utilizing the proceeds for my old life obligations before launching into the new life, October 1949. Footnote to obligations is, many old dependents were given gifts in cash or kind. At the end of the inspection of the old bus body, Baba told the group they were now to return to Meherabad. He himself would come at 2:30, and after some Sufi devotional music, he would say goodbye to each member of the group. It was mid-afternoon, and the strains of songs from the great Sufi mystics floated from the dormitory atop the old military reservoir. Each one in the room was trying to soak in the last essence of the occasion, to stretch each second of time into an eternity, that body, mind, and soul might be wrapped in the endless perfection of the moment. The rhythm swayed and the body swayed, and suddenly one young man of stolid mien dropped unconscious. There was a flutter of activity as restorative measures were applied. He was led in a somewhat dazed condition from the hall, and the songs went on. India has developed its own knowledge through the centuries of the possible side effects of man's search for his soul. In the West, the goal of the boxer is to knock his opponent into physical unconsciousness. In the East, the spiritual aspirant might possibly lapse into a similar state of unconsciousness. The devotions went on, and at last, Baba signified that they were at an end. There was nothing left now but to receive the parting embrace of a goodbye. And this I shall not tell. There is a time in human fullness, as in human sorrow, when the human soul must be allowed to sit within the privacy of its shrouds and smile or weep or caper as it may. They walked down the hill, some smiling, some sad, some still gently weeping. They packed their bags, and that evening, some of them left to go home. What had they left behind? What was this they carried in their hearts? For 1 week, they had been with a simple man of great tenderness. He had laughed with them, played with them, prayed with them. He had been father, mother, son, and lover. He had played on the strings of their hearts until their innermost beings sang. He had drawn the fullness of feeling from them until they had wept at the tale of Nozer and the real miracle.
Thanks, Marianne. Mahu, would you mind unmuting and continuing?
Can you highlight?
Oh, the top of the page.
Okay. This was a man for whom there was no description, who awakened in them things that could not be defined. He was himself, and in that self lay the secret of finding one's own self. No logic was of any use in describing it, discussing it, or explaining it. One had only the choice of experiencing it and being lost in the simplicity of it. Old men became like children, overawed and delighted by the presence of the true parent, yet the parent who at the same time was the child. Young men became old and wise beyond their years, with penetrating insight into the hidden springs which powered the movements of man in the universe. And they found within themselves the reason to be and to continue to be, the sparkling streams of assured, unthinking hope, which is always the seed of youth. Who was this man with whom they had spent this priceless week? He was called Meher Baba, means compassionate father. And thousands flocked about him at the slightest opportunity. But what did it matter who he was? What did it matter what anyone else thought or said? What did matter was this almost overpowering knowledge of having carved through mountains to come back to where one had started, one's own self. Now it was a self which was real, friendly, believing in itself, no longer disconnected with other selves. A self which felt and lived and vibrated as the choiring reed to the tuning note of the universe. With its age-old knowledge, India had once more transmuted the individual into the self. A master alchemist had done it. The real miracle was that it had happened today in a busy world of whirling machines and the exploding energies of giant civilization. But the greatest mystery, that of the self, had been exhibited once more in a timeless process which requires nothing but the touchstone of one who is already one with himself. These were the things that Meher Baba said and did with somewhat more than 1,000 of the followers in India in November of 1955. If sometimes they have not told in the same time relationship which they originally bore to one another, then it has been the fault of the one who has tried to describe them. For he too has labored under his own weighty notions of how the story should be told. All of these things did happen, and within the resources of memory of Ramju and the Quiet One who were there, and the swiftly moving pencil of the scribes Faram and Kishan Sinch, who were also there. This is a true description of what happened and what was said. This is a story of the human heart. However, the human heart is also closely linked to the human mind, which has a persistent quality of inquiry. Part 2 is now offered so that the mind may ponder and speculate on matters of great interest regarding the mechanics of creation. It is Meher Baba who now speaks direct. Very poetic. Part 2. Life and the path. Chapter 1 of Part 2. Death and Immortality. The immersion of the individual in the rude routing of life, causing him to be seriously disturbed by the sudden experience of death, particularly when it takes away someone who has been near and dear to him. When the sight of death becomes too frequent, as in time of war or during an epidemic, the individual's mind tends to protect itself by retiring within a shell of habit and routine. Familiar actions, faces, and surroundings which require no thought or adjustment become at such times a buttress to his emotional balance. But even this wall of cultivated indifference crumbles when the hand of death snatches away someone who has entered deeply into his inner life, someone who perhaps acted as a pivotal point upon which his emotions turned. At such a time, his unquestioning attitude towards life is disturbed, and his mind becomes deeply preoccupied with an intensive search for lasting values. The life of each person is deeply enmeshed in this mystery of death. But it is a mystery which ascends thought instead of dulling it. For if anyone makes a man think intensely about a true nature of life, it is the recurrent theme of death. As the tale of life is told, it pauses frequently to contemplate the gaping holes left by death There is no way to avoid the thought-provoking impact of that inescapable presence. Although none escapes the intensive search for the hidden secret to the meaning of death, few can lift the veil and unravel the mystery. For most, it remains a soul-searing enigma which causes deep restlessness. For some, it offers a wide field for imaginative speculation. For the few, it yields its secret. Many refuse to accept death as the simple, final extinction of the individual, but this reaction is more often a form of unreasoned wish than a matter of unshakable conviction. Even so, this instinctive rebellion should not be lightly dismissed, for much of the vigor of this blind protest against the seeming fact of death springs from an obscure but still functioning intuition. However, this intuitive reaction does not approach the more secure position achieved through reasoned belief based on faith in the authority of seer or on the direct perception of those who know. When a sensitive individual is first faced by a death of deep significance in his circle of close friends, he is usually struck by the transitory nature of all forms of life. Confronted by the undeniable impermanence of the body, yet unfortified by knowledge of some sustaining permanent principle, he often falls into a mood of deep despair or supercilious cynicism. If life is inexorably doomed to extinction, he reasons there can be little meaning in the frantic efforts to achieve. In turn, this thought leaves him in a vacuum of purpose, which may lead him either to a state of supine inaction or may precipitate him into reckless rebellion. To him, existence seems to be conditional, intermittent, and vanishing, while extinction appears to be unqualified, inescapable, and permanent. When such a grim conclusion has been reached, whether consciously or unconsciously, the individual is tempted to rain death and destruction upon others, or to invite it upon himself, merely because death appears to be more lasting than life. The recklessly destructive desperado and the determined suicide being to this type. They cannot accept life as having any real value because their initial unthinking faith in the value of life has been uprooted by the rude shock of death. If death is accepted as real and longer in duration than life, then life is degraded below meaninglessness. Even then, such values in life as truth, beauty, goodness, and love can claim some intrinsic worth despite their fleeting existence. But in practical fact, all needness for the pursuit of even these momentary values is gradually replaced by a sense of hopeless apathy, for one hears constantly a background whisper which says that they too are doomed to vanish one day. If the cat, no, we need to go a little bit up. If the cat, here, sure. If the cat, while stealthily drinking milk, knows that someone is waiting outside their door with a club, she can hardly relish the flavor of her surreptitious meal.
That's good.
Similarly, a man who comes to know that all his achievements must soon brought to naught can hardly have his heart in his efforts. If he stops to reflect that all the people he loves are earmarked for early conversion to dust, then his spontaneous enthusiasm gradually dries up and he is forced to consider what he is striving for. If he tries to cling to those loved ones despite his new awareness, all the desperateness of his ensuing efforts becomes only a sacrifice to vanity. In order to avoid the pain which he is bound to feel at the inevitable loss of his dear ones, he may try to avoid life by adopting the viewpoint that the living are no more than on a par with the dead. The success of such a game depends upon an exact equation. For if he holds the slightest preference for the living, he will be gravely affected when the living become the dead. He is forced finally to face the fact that if death means the extinguishing of his beloved brothers in a blind vacuum of eternity, then the entire game of life is a meaningless tragedy. All courage, sacrifice, and loyalty to ideals becomes a fierce, and all vital seeking takes on the cast of empty endeavor, of much effort without purpose. Fear of loss treads closely upon all earnest attempts to appropriate and inherit the significance of life, depriving it of all sweetness. In short, if death is looked upon as a mere extinction, man tends to lose his balance and is plunged into perpetual gloom. All his dreams of the enduring reality of truth, beauty, and love are refuted and seen by hindsight to have been a blind groping after illusion. His previous ideal of eternity and inexhaustible sweetness instead of filling him with hope and enthusiasm, now reproaches him with the utter senselessness of all earthly values. Thus, death, when not understood, vitiates the whole of life, and the first impulsive answer of inaction or cynicism, which the individual usually forges to meet the question, strands him in a thoroughly dissociated universe of unrelieved weariness. Nevertheless, this gradually prepares him for another attempt to find a more vital answer to the inescapable query. The human mind cannot endure such a stalemate for long, as there is an internal force which insists that the inner nature be in motion. Eventually, the pressure for such motion breaks through the rigidity of such a negative concept of death. A great flood of new interrogation and discovery often breaks out. And in it, the key question now posed by death becomes, what is life? And in it, let me repeat this again. And in it, the key question now posed by death becomes, quote, what is life? The answers supplied are countless and depend upon the passing moods which spring from the deeply rooted ignorance of the interrogator. The first instinctive answer is, life is that which terminated by death. The answer is still completely inadequate, as it involves no positive principle on which a fruitful life can be based, nor can the individual needs for development be met. Such an answer explains neither death nor life. The individual is driven to try to understand life and death along new lines. In italic, it says, instead of looking upon death as the opposite of life, he now inevitably comes to look upon it as the handmaiden of life, He begins to affirm intuitively the reality and eternality of life. Instead of interpreting life in terms of death, man seeks to interpret death in terms of life. Slowly, event by event, he learns to take life again in all earnestness, with a deeper affirming consciousness. As he does so, he is able to give a more constructive response to the recurring sight of death. The challenge of death is now not only accepted and absorbed by life, but is met by a counter challenge. Now, what is death? It is now death's turn to submit itself to critical scrutiny. The most unsophisticated answer to this counter question is, death is only an incident in life. This simple and profoundly true declaration terminates the unendurable chaos precipitated by regarding death as the extinction of life. Soon it is clearly seen that it is futile to try to understand death without first understanding life. As consciousness gradually settles into the balanced approach to the problem, it takes on a healthy tone, which makes it receptive to the truth concerning both life and death. Direct, undimmed knowledge of such truth is available only to spiritually advanced souls. The seers of all time have had direct access to the truth about life and death, and they have repeatedly given a suffering and groping humanity useful information on this point. Their explanations are important because they protect man's mind from erroneous and harmful attitudes towards life and death, and prepare him for perception of the truth. Although direct knowledge of truth requires considerable spiritual perception, nevertheless, even correct intellectual understanding of the relationship of life and death plays an important part in restoring mankind to a healthy outlook. Above incarnate life in birth and beyond disincarnate life after death, the soul is one indivisible, eternal existence. The gestation of individualization of the soul begins with the evolution of its consciousness. Consciousness begins to evolve in incarnate life, and its evolution becomes complete only in incarnate life. Simultaneously with the evolution of consciousness through the evolution of forms or bodies, sanskaras, which there's an asterisk. Do you want me to read the definition of sanskaras or continue? So there's a footnote explains about the sanskaras, which says in the bottom of the page 97, it states, sanskaras are the habit patterns and the unconscious motivations remaining from previous actions in this and in past lives. I repeat this again. Sanskaras are the habit patterns and the unconscious motivations remaining from previous actions in this and in past lives. They are the propelling forces which so largely determine the actions of the individual and leave him so little opportunity for positive action aimed to progressive understanding and development of his own nature. So I repeat this again. Simultaneously with the evolution of consciousness, through the evolution of forms or bodies, sanskaras begin to accumulate. The evolution of form and consciousness and with it, individualization of the human ego mind is complete when the soul attains the human soul for the first time. But because of the accumulated sanskaras, the full evolved consciousness of the soul remains entrapped in illusion and therefore is not directed towards the soul's self-realization or God realization. For self-realization, all sanskaras must be completely wiped out to enable the soul as the individualized ego to be transmuted into the individualized soul in the conscious state of God. Further, the sanskaras that began to accumulate in an incarnate life have to be wiped out in an incarnate life. In order to be wiped out in total, sanskaras must be annulled or cancelled through the process of exact equalization or perfect qualitative and quantitative balancing of all opposite sanskaras, whether good or bad. This is extremely difficult, for the sanskaras have a natural tendency towards preponderance of one opposite over the other, while unbalance of the opposite sanskaras reaches its maximum in an incarnate life. Mere balancing is achieved after death during a period of disincarnate life through the intense subjective pleasure or suffering in the states known as heaven and hell. Each incarnate life is an opportunity for the realization of one's true self. Each death or disincarnate life is an opportunity for achieving a balance to start another birth with its further chance of self-realization. If the opportunity were fully taken, one incarnate life could be sufficient to make the individual realize this goal. But it is well nigh impossible to attain the initiative and longing to do so without getting involved in the illusory maze of innumerable opposite experiences. The contact of a perfect master is invaluable in calling a halt to the dizzy gyration of incarnate and disincarnate lives in illusion and awakening the individual to the real knowledge of self. I think it's good to stop here. What do you think?
Thanks, Mahu. And let me stop the recording.